Is this book worth your time and your money? And what's the one thing that I felt was missing from it? Stay tuned for an honest review of Steven Bartlett's brand new book, Diary of a CEO: 33 Laws of Business and Life. Hi everyone, my name is Mili and I'm on a mission to make personal development fun and accessible. Because of that, it's probably not a surprise for you that I'm a fan of Steven Bartlett's podcast, The Diary of a CEO. And so when he announced at the end of May that he had written a brand new book, I decided to pre order it. And luckily, it arrived on the release date at the end of August. So I spent the last couple of days reading the book and bookmarking a lot of it. You can see I read the books not just as books, but I also highlight a lot of things, take notes, and just make sure that I'm really using them. And today I wanted to bring you my honest review of whether I think this book is worth it. So, first of all, what is this book about? Well, Steven says that this book is not actually about strategy and it's not meant to give you like specific strategies and tactics to implement. It is much more about the fundamental laws that are going to make you great and are going to help you to build great things. Which I think in this case, he talks a lot more about how to build great teams and great companies. So the book itself is split into four different parts, and I personally think that you're not going to find each of those parts equally applicable unless you are a CEO or business leader yourself. So part one is all about the self and understanding who you are, how you operate. Part two is called a story, and it's all about making yourself heard and seen through the power of marketing. Part three is called philosophy, but to me personally, I would rename that as productivity because it is really all about how we work with other people and how to make the most of everyone. And part four was all about the team. That was the shortest part. And it is all about how to work with other people and build a great culture and a team. To be perfectly honest, I don't think that every part is going to be equally applicable to you, especially if you don't own your business or have aspirations to. But I think that part one, the self, and part three, philosophy or productivity, are the ones that everyone should read. Because to me personally, they were the most fundamental, the most interesting, and I think anyone will benefit from knowing about those laws. You'll find part two applicable to you if you're a marketing professional or if you have any sort of service or product that you're trying to sell. I think it's slightly less applicable if you're just working a normal job, but at the same time, it's helpful to understand what principles company use on us to actually make us buy more products. And so, even though I didn't find it as fascinating and insightful as parts one and three, I still think this was an interesting part to read. Part four was the shortest one, and it's all about building great teams and becoming a great leader. And even though I think this one is really fundamental and really important for people that are managers and team leaders and CEOs, I think for the average person, probably those laws are not going to be as applicable. With that said, though, I think the book was well structured and it takes this inside out principle that I think is very much applicable. So we first need to work on ourselves before we go and engage with the world and start kind of working with other people. So one of the things that Steven says literally on page 3 of the book is that he wants to make sure that the book is not too long because most books are too long and he wants to say everything he wants to say in as many words as needed. And so I made myself a post-it note in here that was literally saying, let's see if he can actually do that. And I'm happy to report that I believe he had achieved that because the book is about 320 pages of actual text without the references and so on. And there are 33 laws, so all of them are very concise, well written, well structured, and at no point in the book did I feel that it was too long, dragging, or repeating the same thing 500 times. In terms of structure for each law, I found it very well structured and very easy to read. And Stephen actually starts each chapter with about 2-3 sentences that make you a promise. So, what you're going to get out of reading this chapter. And by doing this, he actually employs one of his own laws, which is basically that you have 5 seconds to capture people's attention. And so he really does that in every single chapter. And I found this to be working. I read every single page of the book. After that, you would usually have some sort of a story that illustrates the principle, and he really leverages a lot of experts that he had interviewed on his podcast. So you may encounter statements or ideas that you may have heard before on the podcast, but they're developed outside of that context. So it's not just regurgitation of his actual podcast. Outside of that, there are a lot of really helpful illustrations. There are kind of summaries, or the most important ideas are well laid out. And when you get to the end of the chapter, you'll have a summary of each of the laws. So I found that a really great way if I was quickly kind of wanting to revise and look into what was this law actually about. That part was really, really helpful. Then after each law, you'll also have, I called it a quotable moment. So basically some of those quotes that you'd read sometimes on Pinterest, but they contained the core idea of this chapter in a more quotable Pinteresty style. Now, the one thing that I promise I'm going to tell you what I felt was missing from the book was actually a place or a question to reflect upon. So if you look into my book, you'll see that I have a lot of pink tabs, and all of those pink tabs are all about reflection questions. So when I'm reading personal development books, I like to highlight some interesting questions that make me think. But in this book, I didn't actually find that many of them. And so what I did is I ended up writing my own, because I would go back and reflect on every single chapter, every single law, to make sure that I understand it, number one, but also I am applying it. I'm taking some sort of action or some sort of insight from the book, because reading a book is one thing, applying the book is a whole another thing, and I want to make sure that I'm actually learning, not just reading. So if you're like me and you like to maximize your personal development time, I've made a free resource for you, a workbook with all of my reflection questions. So you'll find a very quick summary of each of the laws and then 3 to 4 reflection questions that can help take your learning and understanding to a whole another level. If you want to download that completely for free, it's in the description box below. So let's now dive into each of the parts, and I will summarize for each of them what are some of the most interesting ideas or the most helpful lessons that I took from the book. This is not an executive summary, this is not about going through every single law, but I want to highlight the core ideas that made an impression personally on me and I think will be useful to you as well. So part 1 was all about the self, and one of the core ideas or the laws was called "you can't change your beliefs." So when I read that, being a mindset coach, I straight away was like, Steven, what do you mean you can't change your beliefs? Obviously you can. So even though it starts very much as a controversial, slightly triggering statement, I found his justification to be quite interesting and actually valid. And then he talks about what makes us change our mind, that we can't do it under duress, but we can do it with a lot of evidence. And he talks about specific practices that you can implement to change your own mind or to change the mind of other people. Another insight that I found a bit confronting, to be perfectly honest, was all about lesson 2, which is how we learn. And I'm sure you've heard this before, that the best way to learn is to actually teach. But the way that Steven phrased it is that you need to release your knowledge. And I realized that for the longest time, I've not been releasing the knowledge, I've been sort of hoarding it. And so my video right now is an attempt to release a lot of the insights and knowledge I've got from this book. Another really interesting trick that I want to share with you that I learned from this book is how you can actually increase your chances of doing something. And that is by asking yourself a yes/no question in the form of, will I do this? Right? So will I read this book? Will I record this video? Will I eat this piece of cake? And if you ask yourself a yes/no question, you don't have this, yeah, I'll eat a piece of cake, but only because of this, this, and that. It's very yes or no, right? And it doesn't leave space for those excuses. And it's easier to monitor yourself and to understand yourself and increase your commitment to actually taking good actions. This part had so many good lessons, good laws, that I find it very hard to just narrow it down to a couple. And another one that I just want to mention is the 5 buckets theory. So Steven really talks about how we all have 5 buckets and the order that you fill them in makes a huge difference. So the first two are knowledge and skills. And if you skip those buckets and you go, for example, for resources, so making more money, rather than building skills and knowledge, you're building yourself and your career on really, really shaky foundations. And so it made me realize that I should really be focusing on filling those two buckets first, and everything else like resources and network and reputation are going to come a little bit later down the line if I've made sure that my skills and knowledge buckets are full. This part also contains some really helpful reminders, such as why you should never disagree with people, how to really fast track your health because it's the only foundation that you have. And it also talked about how to replace bad habits and what to do when no one is watching. So probably one of my most favorite parts of this book is this part one, and definitely worth reading. The only thing that I thought would have been really helpful at the end of each chapter, besides the reflection questions, is actually references to specific podcast episodes where experts talk about that law or that concept. Part two, let's get into part two. I'll preface this by saying that I spent the last 4.5 years learning about marketing and sales and consumer psychology. So because of that, a lot of the topics covered in this chapter were quite familiar to me. However, if you're not someone that has read a lot of marketing books or doesn't really know much about cognitive biases, I think you'll also find this chapter very interesting. Because Steven talks about this from two perspectives, both if you have a product that you want to advertise and make sure people see it, but also if you're a customer and you want to understand how brands manipulate us to an extent. I think that this book reveals a lot about consumer psychology and the tactics brands use. The one example that I found actually very applicable to my own work was the example of Uber and how they removed a lot of the friction and problems that customers were facing in the past, how they removed uncertainty and anxiety, and how that actually propelled them to become a billion-dollar company and completely radically change the transportation industry. So that whole chapter made me think about some of the processes and services that we have in my workplace and how can we remove a little bit of that psychological uncertainty to make sure that we're being as transparent as possible and increasing satisfaction. Overall, I felt like this entire part could be summed up with the words: perception is much easier to create or influence than it is to create value. And so if you already have a good product, good service that you know is working, but no one knows about it, you should really focus on your marketing, because good marketing can make or break your product. And if you're still listening and still watching, that's great. It means that me implementing the 5-second rule at the beginning of this video actually worked. Because one of the laws that Steven talks about in this book is that you only have 5 seconds to capture people's attention. And if you're still watching, give me a thumbs up so I know that you're here. Part 3, I feel like I need to roll up my sleeves because that one was the meatiest one. And that was the part that gave me so many ideas about processes and things that I want to implement at work, in my own business. And that's the part that I feel like you're going to get the most value out of reading. It's the longest part, containing the most laws, but also I think it is the most interesting one. Part 3 starts with introducing you to the Kaizen philosophy, and that is being referenced all throughout this whole part in different laws. And if you haven't heard about Kaizen, which I hadn't personally, it's the philosophy that Toyota as a company employs, and how many really microscopic improvements they make every year to improve their processes. So what I found really fascinating is that they take, I think he said, like about 1 million ideas every year, and those ideas all come from people on the shop floor. They're not just things that are trickling down from management. And so it made me realize how important it is to encourage ideas from people, something that I've personally seen and experienced. But at the same time, it talks about practically how you can encourage people and give them that safety and that process to make their ideas great and easily implementable. Another really fascinating idea from this chapter that I took was about the 2 types of decisions. And Steven talks about type 1 and type 2 decisions. Type 1 being the irreversible, really, really important decisions that you literally can't go back from. And type 2 being the kind of decision that is still important but is fully reversible. Yes, you may fail, yes, you may experience some consequences, but at the same time, you can always go back. It's not irreversible, it's not finite. So, this law really made me confront how much I have been treating things in my own business like they're type 1 decisions, so they're irreversible and have such crazy consequences that I can never go back from. And that made me really afraid to fail, which is why I hadn't posted a lot of ideas, a lot of videos and things that I had recorded. And so realizing that most of the things that you do in your own life are going to be type 2 decisions, not type 1 decisions, was that kick in the butt that I needed to make me not just sit down and record this video, but actually go ahead and publish it. Another slightly strange idea that I hadn't come across before was that pressure is a privilege. And if you're someone that has been reading about the effects of stress and burnout and overwhelm, you're probably like, what? How is that a privilege? But what Steven actually talked about in this book, and is very well researched and well argued, is that there were experiments done on people who thought that stress was a negative thing, and people who didn't see stress as that bad. So people who thought that stress was actually a negative thing not only had their heart rate go up, but their blood vessels were constricting. And correctly, that led to them having negative health outcomes. But those people that actually didn't see stress as a bad thing, they saw it as an enhancer of their performance, still had their heart rate go up, but didn't have their blood vessels constricting. So they were getting kind of the best of both worlds, an enhanced performance while maintaining their health. And that really surprised me because I was quite used to the idea that stress is bad, but actually having a healthy level of stress and reframing that as I'm excited for this is going to make my performance even better, it's going to help me, was such a great perspective shift and something that I'm going to take every time I'm doing something really stressful in the future. And finally, the one key idea that I want to also highlight from this chapter, from this part, is the idea about negative manifestation, as Steven calls it. So, you know how we are very much conditioned to visualize the best possible outcomes and success? He argues, and I can definitely vouch from personal experience, how useful it is to do what's called a pre-mortem exercise. So basically, it's all about imagining that something that you want to do, let's say an idea, project that you want to launch, has failed. And you really vividly picture that that has failed, people are not happy, and you go ahead and try to figure out why. What has gone wrong? Why was this a bad idea? Why did this fail? In this way, it can really help you to identify potential weaknesses, and in some cases, it may even help you realize that the whole thing is a no-go and you shouldn't be doing it. And again, from personal experience, this is something that's been super, super useful to avoid a lot of pitfalls. And that book, really reading it, was a great reminder for me to go ahead and schedule a meeting with my team on the Monday, and we're going to be doing a pre-mortem exercise for a new process that I want to put in place. So I'm actually really excited to see what the outcomes of that pre-mortem are going to be. So in this part, you're also going to learn about things like the 1 in 60 rule, also why you shouldn't be an ostrich, how to take your skills to a place that they're really valued, and a lot more. I wouldn't be doing it a service if I just go through each of those laws. I think just read a book and you're going to get a lot of really great insights from part 3. And finally, part 4, where I said that probably the least applicable part out of the 4 for the average person, but I still felt like there were some interesting ideas that you can take from. And the one thing that I want to highlight that I found insightful, even though I'm not necessarily leading a large team, was the idea of the 3 bars. And so Steven talks about this idea that is actually his own invention. It's basically how to hire people. So he talks about the fact that like he would evaluate a person and look at them and ask themselves if everyone in the company was having the same values, the same attitude as that person, would that enhance the team, maintain the team, or lower kind of the skills and the attitudes in the team. And so if you start realizing that multiplying one person 10 times is actually going to lower the team standards and morale, that person needs to go. And it was such an interesting idea that I hadn't thought about, but it made me think about the fact that you can apply this principle not just to people you're hiring, because I'm sure not every single person watching this video is going to be hiring someone. You can apply this to a lot of your own actions. So, for example, you can take the action of reading a book and asking yourself, if I would be reading more books, would that enhance my life, maintain my life, or lower the quality of my life? And if you're eating a piece of cake, you can say, well, if I was to eat 10 pieces of cake today, would that enhance my life, maintain my life, or lower the quality of my life? So it sort of puts your actions into perspective of, it's okay if you do this once, but what happens if you do this longer term? Which is the same as if you're hiring people for your own team. The other key idea from this part was all about what makes a great leader and how you should actually treat people differently. Still with respect, but not having the exact same communication and approach to every single person, which I have to be honest, I found quite surprising, but it was using the example of Sir Alex Ferguson and Manchester United. So if you are a football fan, you probably enjoy those last couple of laws a lot. And law 33 is a surprise, so I'm not going to be talking about that, but if you get the book, you'll see what I mean. So, how would I rate this book, and is it worth your time? I would say yes, definitely it's worth your time, worth your money. I think there is so much knowledge packed into what I think is a relatively short book. 320 pages for that many ideas and knowledge was really, really good. And the only reason I would give it 4.5, not the full 5 stars, is because, as I said, I was missing a little bit more of that actionable and reflection part. So this is not really a problem. Obviously, if you want to just read a book, that's perfectly fine. Or if you, like me, like to not just read but take action on the things you're learning, definitely go and download the workbook. It's going to have a lot of those reflection and actionable questions that will help you to apply what you're learning about. So if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you can give me a thumbs up to let me know about that, leave me a comment below, and subscribe for more videos on topics such as productivity and how to be the best version of yourself. That's it for this one. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!